board him or fine him. Well, I have two stories for you tonight. Both of them are centered in Appalachia. One of them is a story that I wrote about a young man in a southwestern Virginia coal camp. And the other one I wrote about Madison County, right next door. So let's start with that one. Madison County, 1969. If you do math quickly, you'll find out that that's like, 55 years ago? Long time. In the time between my graduation from Mars Hill College in May and when I entered NC State in September 69, I had a grant to do a housing survey in Madison County. Now, Madison County, as most of you know, is a rural, mountainous county right next door, but it was at the time a depopulating county, the only one in North Carolina, the only county that was actually losing people. Now, how did this happen? Well, during World War II, a lot of the families and young men left to go north to the landing craft and the tank factories in Ohio and Michigan, and they stayed. After World War II, the factories reverted back to making trucks and cars, and the young men invited their relatives to come up and take advantage of the good paying jobs in the 1950s and 60s, and more people left. And that's how Madison became a depopulating county. Now, the aforementioned grant, I obtained that through the Opportunity Corporation of Buncombe-Madison County, the local anti-poverty agency. And I believe it's still extant. It's still here. It's in Buncombe and still in Madison counties. And what I was going to do, what I was hired to do, was to go through the county and plot every single habitation in the county on a map. We had 5 classes of housing, beginning with standard and ending with dilapidated. Now, what was going to happen with this information is that the Opportunity Corporation was going to take it and use the statistics in their grant to apply for money from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. I see a lady here nodding. She knows about this. She knows about this. And that was to secure low-income housing in Madison County. The need was great. And this was the peak of anti-poverty legislation and funding in the country at that time. And Madison wanted its share. Okay, my partner in crime, Paul Scott, another graduate of Mars Hill, and I started in the southwestern point of the county. And he was driving the little Chevy Vega, and I had the big U.S. Geological Survey maps on my lap. And we started wrapping around the county, finding all of these houses. Now, at this particular time, there were not many good paved roads in Madison. Most of the roads were single lane, rutted dirt roads, and what I came to call lots of goat paths. What we would have to do is drive up as far as we could, park the car, put on our hiking boots, and walk sometimes a mile up the mountain, down the mountain, up the next mountain, and all of this was in Madison County to access the houses. And sometimes the houses were there, sometimes they weren't. That was a big surprise. It was June, July, and mid-August, hot and dusty out there. Oh, hot and dusty. We carried big milk jugs of cool water in sack lunches because cafes were very few and far between, and you never knew when you'd be able to get a meal or something cold to drink. I guess the bathroom practices, I'll leave that for another time. Okay. So we're going along and we're checking out all of these houses, and I very seldom was able to write a 1 on the map. That was for a standard house. Those were confined to the towns of Mars Hill, Marshall, and Hot Springs. Most of the houses that I surveyed were a 3 or a 4, and that was easy because I could see the outhouse perched over the creek. Straight piping was very common, and not a lot of people even had electricity then. Paul and I would fetch up to a cabin and go in. If it was the 10th house that we had plotted, they got a 4-page face-to-face interview. Now, sometimes the interviews went well, sometimes they didn't, because these were very private people, and they did not have much use for what they called the government. Not much use at all. Now, the Opportunity Corporation community organizers had put out the word that Paul and I were okay people, that we were surveying and asking nosy questions to try and get the county some housing. So most people were very cooperative. So we would pull up at one of these cabins. And oh, by the way, there were a sprinkling, maybe 5 or 6 single-wide mobile homes in Madison County. They were new to the county, had just been brought in, and it would be parked right beside the 100-year-old pole cabin. And the cabin was still being used for storage or for an overflow of visiting children, grandparents, in-laws and outlaws. But Paul and I would pull up and we would be invited into that beautiful pole cabin. Now, we would be offered a hand-woven rush-bottom, straight-back chair sitting on the puncheon floor. Do y'all know what a puncheon floor is? No? Mm-hmm. That's when you cut a tree, we call it a pole, cut a pole, and then take a foot adze and cut down the middle of the tree horizontally and use that as the floor. You line them up together like little soldiers, and you have a somewhat even stepping floor. Not exactly, but somewhat. And then we would be offered a glass of cool buttermilk from the spring house and a dip of snuff. Now, as I said, these were very private people. And if the man of the house was there when we pulled up for the interview, he would slip out and leave the survey to the ladies. Now, we knew that he was listening right behind the closed door, and so did the women folk. So their answers were very carefully parsed. Some people might call the inhabitants of Madison, they might call them superstitious and suspicious, but we preferred to call them careful. They were careful in who they talked to and the information that they shared. And they were so fond of the old ways of doing things. They clung to them like a drowning man would cling to a life preserver. A lot of them spoke in accents of Middle English, which came later to be known as Appalachian English. And a lot of the words and phrases they used came right from the Canterbury Tales. Here's an example. Whit, did you query me? Forthy, don't like that crazy old electricity. And Moon wants a house in their abode. Y'all know what I said? I won't be specific. You can figure it out. And out in the fields, we saw antique tractors from the 1920s and 1930s plowing along, and still you could find teams of draft horses, mules, and oxen also plowing in the fields. It was a wonderful place to spend the summer. It truly was, truly was. Now, outside of the cabins, there were gardens. And often when we pulled up, we would be offered some cucumbers, some lettuce, some squash. And up on the hillsides, we saw children, very curious children, hoeing potatoes, tobacco, and cabbages. Those were the cash crops, meaning you sell the crop and you have enough to pay your taxes and buy seed for the next year. And then you live off the land otherwise. Not a bad way to live. A little hard, but not a bad way to live. Now, we also sidestepped chickens, angry roosters, and barnyard geese and suffered their bites. And believe me, if Paul were here today, he could pull up his pants leg and show you what a goose will do to your calf. They will wring a hunk out of your calf if they get up to you. So we had a good time fighting and dancing with angry geese. The cattle and the hogs were on the loose. Now you might think, well, how could you tell whose stock was whose stock? Well, they ate the mast in the woods, and they ate the grass along the roadsides, and the owners notched their ears, and that's how you identified them. the type of notch they had, the number of notches, whether there was a strike or a crescent taken out, that identified the owner of the livestock. Now, about midsummer, we reached Hot Springs. Hot Springs was a lovely little town on the French Broad River. The river ran right under that big bridge that goes into Hot Springs. And there was a row of houses on the upper bank of the river, and we had to check those houses out. So we parked the Vega and started toward the first house. There was a woman sitting on her front porch, and she started to holler at us, "Run! Run!" Well, we looked around to see what it was we were supposed to run from, and there's a 5 to 6 black racer, a constricting snake, chasing us. We thought it was chasing us. Well, she hollered some more, "Turn aside! Turn aside!" Well, we did. We took a right angle turn and turned aside, and that snake, intent on its own serpentine business, just wriggled right on down the road past us. That was only one of the reptile encounters that we had. About mid-July, we were surveying in the Big Laurel community, and we came upon an old farmhouse. It looked dilapidated in that it might be vacant, but you never could really be sure since people were living in all species of housing there. So we approached it, and it just happened to be number 10, so we could not sit at the curb or sit at the side of the dirt road and decide what it was. We had to go in and check. So we stepped up on the porch, and Paul immediately fell through 3 rotted floorboards into the crawl space. And let me tell you, it was a crawl space, because down there were crawling several copperheads. It was their mating season, and they had gathered for a viper party. Well, uttering a series of curses and expletives, Paul lifted himself up through the floorboards. There was one copperhead clinging to his pants leg. Fortunately, he was not bitten, and we learned to carry big, thick walking sticks. Now, as we went up the goat paths into the deep woods, we often encountered those heavy-bodied timber rattlers, so sticks were very useful there. And every creek's deep hole sheltered a snapping turtle. So we go on with the survey. We are seeing many interesting things. We're talking to fascinating people. We're learning a lot about the ancestry of people, about their heritage. And at one point, we went up, and this happened to us several times, drove up as far as we could, parked the car, and then started hiking up the path into the woods. Now, the timber was 70 years old, and under the hardwood canopy, the forest was dark and mysterious. There was a bold stream surging out from under the thickets and the rhododendron hells. Rhododendron hell is a very thick conglomeration of rhododendron, been growing for decades and decades, high and thick, and the only thing that can get through it is, oddly enough, a bear. So here come the streams. It was not unusual for a grim-faced man holding a shotgun to step out from behind a poplar or a white oak tree, look menacingly at us, and growl, "That's fur enough, young'uns." Well, that was our cue. We turned wordlessly and skedaddled down the path away from there. There was moonshine being made up there, and we may have missed a few houses, but we didn't get shot. And I just drew a question mark on that location. In the afternoon, when we returned our maps to the Opportunity Corporation for the night, someone took hold of those, because the next morning, those question marks were expunged. Now, I wonder if that was a relative of the moonshiner or somebody who's just trying to keep us from getting killed. Madison County in the summer of 1969. was clinging to its old ways. We reached the southeastern corner of the county, and the survey was finally completed in mid-August. The Opportunity Corporation took those statistics and applied to HUD, and they were granted a right sizable amount of money. And the next year, 27 apartment units were built in 3 different locations around Marshall. And those apartments are still there. My husband and I were over there the other night for dinner, and we saw those apartments still there. And I pointed to them. I said, okay, that's one of the sets of apartments. The other one's on this street, and the other one's down by the river. Okay, so those were finally built, and 27 families moved from the hollers into town the following year. So this brings us up to about 1971. Now, the apartments were very nice, and people didn't know what to think about them. They had water inside, they had the scary old electricity, and they had a bathroom. They had a house inside the abode. Most amazing. Now, they didn't have a spring house, but there was a refrigerator. The cook stove did not use wood, and heat was accessed by turning a little dial up on the wall. Very odd. There was a small sitting out porch on each one of the units, and it looked out onto the road, but the green views of the mountains and the fields were gone. Children went to school in a modern brick schoolhouse, a beautiful brick building, and it had a cafeteria and a playground. They had never seen such as that. Women's lives were suddenly easier and simplified. Groceries were not out the back screen door in the garden or in the hog lot, the chicken run, or the barn. They were down the street at the grocery store or the commodities food program that came by once a month. Men were largely idle, or they would get some day labor in town. People were finally separated from the land and its provision, its culture, its ancestry, and its beautiful ways. So here's food for thought from Madison County, 1969. Was this progress? Was this a good thing? I'll let you decide. Thank you. Well, that was a true story. That was a true story. My second story is one that I wrote right off the top of my head, and it's a good example of what we call a historical narrative, and that is when you take a slice of history and then you research it, find out everything you can about it, the mores, the customs, the society that it was set in, and then you think up some characters, and that's the fun part. And you construct those characters in the story, in the milieu of the historical narrative. Reuben May. Reuben May was growing up hard in the southwestern Virginia hill country, coal country. His father was a miner, as was his father before him. They lived in the Higgy Creek Township, a coal camp owned by the Black Rock Coal and Coke Company. Their ramshackle house was constructed of the cheapest materials: unimproved sawmill laps, crumbling asphalt shingles, tar paper. The 3 inside rooms were papered with newsprint, which kept out some of the winter winds, not too many. The land that the company township was built on was contaminated by runoff from the mine tailings. Higgy Creek had turned a poisonous rust yellow color. All creek life had long since been extinguished. The odd trees and shrubs were yellow and rust-colored. A thick gray coal miasma lingered over the township day and night as the coke ovens smoked on. The colors of Reuben's life were rust and yellow and gray. Living with him in that ramshackle house were his 2 sisters and his 3 younger brothers, his mother, Mary Ann, and his father, Sam Bob. Reuben could feel the coal mine calling to him. He could feel it. Accidents, maimings, black lung, overburden collapses, death. Several of his schoolmates had already left for mines number 2 and 4 at age 14, but at 12, Reuben had a few years left. He thought constantly of what he might do other than to go down. Nightly, he heard his mother and his father in deep discussions. Marianne would beg Sam Bob, "Oh, please, please, don't let them go down there. There must be another way." Sam Bob mumbled that the boys would earn money for the household until they got married and moved out. This would be at 16 years old or so when they left. And the 2 daughters would marry at 14 or 15 and they would go their own way. Life was very hard and fast for children in the southwestern Virginia country. Reuben was a listener at the door, and he heard his parents' discussions. He racked his brain in vain trying to figure out an alternative for his life. If only he had some land that he might farm, but his family was dependent upon the coal mine existence, and there was no land for him to farm. Every morning, Reuben walked out of that dark cove into the schoolhouse in town, and he passed by Mr. Harmon's sunlit, fenced vegetable plots and his fat, sleek cattle in the field. Oh, his mouth watered for those fresh vegetables and the beef on the hoof. If only he had some land, he thought, if only. His family's rations were dried beans, some canned goods, and salt pork, paid for in script at the Black Rock Company store and tallied against Sam Bob's weekly earnings. Reuben had developed in his short life a conversational relationship with Mr. Harmon. Mr. Harmon had no children, and he really enjoyed talking with the eager little boy. "Boy has some gumption, most unusual," he thought, as they discussed the life cycle of the crops Mr. Harmon had planted, and the life cycle of the cattle out in the field. Reuben absorbed farm knowledge like the sour land absorbed the rain. Mr. Harmon saw him looking yearningly at the maturing vegetables, and one afternoon they were hanging on the fence talking, and Mr. Harmon asked, "Would you like some vegetables?" And Reuben said, "Oh, yes, I would, but I don't have any money." "Well, what have you got to trade?" said Mr. Harmon. Reuben searched his pockets, this one, that one. His hand closed on his blue Aggie, a beautiful marble that he had won at shootout that very day. He had played with great concentration and focus for over a month, playing less desirable marbles until he had won the coveted blue Aggie. Oh, he looked at it. It was his pride and joy, but he also thought of his mother's face when he brought home those vegetables. It didn't take him but a minute. "All right," he agreed. He handed the blue marble to Mr. Harmon, who rolled it around in his palm. He also admired the Aggie. "Oh, it's a blue and a fine one, but you know I really like them green ones." "Oh, I can get you a green one. It might take me a little bit of time, but yes, I'll get a green one." Poor Reuben, he was suddenly afraid of losing the cabbages and the squash. Mr. Harmon nodded his head. Well, you take this sack of vegetables, and when you get the green one, you bring it. You hear? Well, Reuben was very thankful. He ran home with his prize. Oh, he couldn't wait to show his family what he had gotten for them for their dinner. Oh, they slurped up the fried squash and the cabbage and salt pork for supper, and there was a lot left over, too. They wondered where Reuben had gotten this. Sam Bob was sure that he had stolen the vegetables and that the sheriff would be coming any time. Why, he threatened to wear Reuben out. No, 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 Dad. Mr. Harmon liked my blue Aggie. I traded it to him for the vegetables, and now he wants a green one, and I'll get him a green one, and I'll get more vegetables too, he promised the family. Why, see here, said Mary Ann, turning the sack inside out. Here's your blue marble. Why, it's just like Benjamin finding the gold cup in Benjamin's sack when the brothers were going to Egypt to buy food. Why, you're going to have to give this back to Mr. Harmon. Aha! Shouted Sam Bob. Whipping off his belt, he charged after Reuben, who fled through the door. Well, it took Reuben about 2 weeks to finally earn the green marble. He looked for Mr. Harmon every day that week. He looked yearningly at the pole beans on their trellises, growing longer and fuller by the day. Oh, he thought he could just taste those green beans with fat back because he'd never tasted that before. But he certainly wanted to. But that Friday, there was Mr. Harmon at the fence. He was standing there smiling like a possum as Reuben came down the road. See here, Mr. Harmon. Here's your blue marble I paid you. Well, I told you I liked the green ones better. Have you got one today? Just so happens I do. And he gave Mr. Harmon the green marble. Proudly, he gave it to him. Mr. Harmon said, well, come on in here and we'll get some vegetables. How about some new taters and some green beans? So Mr. Harmon took the spading fork, went to the end of the row of potatoes and very delicately began to unearth the potatoes, tender and young, small in their thin skins. Meanwhile, Reuben was at the bean frame and he was picking the green beans one by one, gently, tenderly, not wanting to break the stems of the leaves or injure the vines in any way. Mr. Harmon took the bounty, put it in the sack, handed it to Reuben, took the green marble in return. Then they began to have a conversation. Mr. Harmon wanted to know what he felt about dealing with the Japanese beetles on the beans and the Mexican beetles and the potato bugs and the squash bugs. How do you handle these pests? Well, Reuben had some good ideas. Mr. Harmon was impressed with the knowledge that this young boy was gaining. Then he asked him, well, how about them tomato hornworms? Well, those were a bad pest on tomatoes. And Reuben thought a minute, and then he said, you know, if you wait till afternoon, them caterpillars have got the leaves and the vines almost stripped. You got to get out early in the morning and look for where the caterpillar laid her eggs. Get them off before they hatch into them caterpillars. Mr. Harmon acknowledged that he had a good idea. And then he said thoughtfully, you know, I really like them red marbles awful well. Reuben went home. He found the green marble nestled in between the green beans. I don't know what this means, he thought, but Mr. Harmon, he wants him a red marble. I'll get him a red marble, but oh, they're awfully dear. Everybody wants a red marble. And then he thought some more and he said, oh, but they're red like ripe tomatoes. That Monday, he actually won a red marble. He took it off of Jinx Sizemore and after school ran up the road to see Mr. Harmon, who was standing there waiting at the fence, grinning at him. He already had a big sack full of red ripe tomatoes waiting for Reuben. Oh, there were some for supper. There were some to juice. Plenty to put up on the window ledges to get ripe. and bunches to can. Oh, how exciting the family would have. Tomatoes all winter now. Reuben was so excited, so excited. And he told his mother, he said, Mr. Harmon offered me a job. He asked me if I would help him this summer out in the field. He wants to expand his vegetable plots. He wants me to help him break the new ground and add the soil amendments and make the plots for the springtime. He wants me to help him. And I told him I would. He said he would give me folding money and vegetables. He was so excited he was dancing a jig around those tomatoes. All that summer, the two of them worked together. They broke the new ground. They added the soil amendments. They harvested the vegetables as each vegetable became mature. And they loaded the trucks that came to take the vegetables to the big city. Reuben earned folding money and took home vegetables beside. It was such a help to his family to have that job. In mid-July, Reuben saw a big old farm truck come into the barnyard. It had high board sides. And several of those beautiful, sleek cattle, they were herded up the ramp into that truck, and the backboard set in place, and that truck pulled off. Reuben didn't know what was going on. Mr. Harmon said, those cows are going to the auction, and that big old steer, he's going to the butcher's. If you come back tonight after supper, there'd be a surprise for you. When Reuben returned that night, there were 25 pounds of fresh beef, portioned, rolled up in brown butcher's paper, tied with string. And Mr. Harmon said to him, this here's for your mama. You tell her you are the best worker I've ever had and the smartest boy I know. And I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning for work. But Mr. Harmon, he didn't see Reuben bright and early the next morning or any other morning because that good man had died of a heart attack during the night. But his death did not disturb their collaboration because Mr. Harmon, without heirs, had left the vegetable plots, the house, the barn, the woodlot, the livestock, and over 150 acres of beautiful prime pasture land to Reuben May, who now had a life above ground. In time, he would hire his brothers as he expanded the farm and its holdings, and he was always grateful and spoke of his gratitude for the kind Mr. Harmon for his mentorship and his gift, his great gift. Today, May Harmon farm trucks bearing the logo Farm Fresh Produce and USDA Prime Beef, proudly grown in Higgy Creek, I might add, can be seen all over Southwest Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, and Northeastern Kentucky, making their deliveries a successful business. Oh, and on the morning that the estate attorney read the will, he pulled out of his pocket and gave to Reuben a red marble. Thank you. That was great.